when a scrappy, injured stray dog darted into the middle of a high-profile HOA meeting. No one expected Keanu Reeves to stand up for him. What began as a quiet act of kindness, offering the terrified dog a meal, soon unraveled into a full-blown battle against corruption, betrayal, and one man's relentless fight to protect the innocent. This wasn't just about saving a dog. It was about exposing the truth, mending broken souls, and proving that even the smallest lives can ignite the biggest changes. The moonlit street was hauntingly silent, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the warm summer breeze. Keanu Reeves adjusted the strap of his leather bag slung across his shoulder, his footsteps echoing softly against the pavement. His nightly walks had become his refuge, a way to escape the lingering weight of memories that refused to fade. Tonight was no different, or so he thought. A sharp, muffled yelp shattered the stillness. Keanu froze mid-step, his sharp eyes narrowing as he turned toward the sound. It was coming from the alley up ahead, a narrow passage shrouded in darkness. Instinct kicked in before logic could, and his pace quickened. As he approached, his breath caught. A scruffy, thin dog was tangled in a crude wire snare, its matted fur catching the faint glow of a flickering streetlight. The dog's ribs jutted out beneath its filthy coat, and its left hind leg hung awkwardly, as though it had been injured long ago. Thrashed weakly, its desperate eyes meeting Keanu's. Keanu crouched, his voice calm and soothing. "Easy, buddy. I'm here to help." The dog growled faintly, more out of fear than aggression, but it stilled as Keanu carefully reached for the wire. His hands worked quickly, ignoring the sharp pricks of the jagged metal. "You've had a rough time, haven't you?" he murmured, his voice steady but filled with compassion. Just as he freed the dog, the crunch of heavy footsteps on gravel made Keanu glance over his shoulder. The tall, broad-shouldered man in a pristine HOA uniform strode toward him, a flashlight beam cutting through the dim alley. "What do you think you're doing?" the man barked, his voice cold and authoritative. Keanu stood slowly, cradling the trembling dog in his arms. "Helping," he replied simply, his tone calm but unyielding. The man scoffed, adjusting the badge on his chest that read Paul Clayton, HOA president. "That stray's been causing trouble all over the neighborhood, digging through trash, scaring residents. HOA policy is clear: no strays allowed." Keanu's jaw tightened. He's not causing trouble. He's starving and scared. And now he's with me. Clayton's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. "You're new here, Mr. Reeves, so I'll make this simple. Rules are rules. You let that animal go, or you'll be facing fines, penalties, and possible eviction." Keanu didn't flinch. Instead, he adjusted the dog in his arms, meeting Clayton's glare with a quiet intensity. "If standing up for him means breaking your rules, then so be it." For a moment, the air between them crackled with tension. Clayton's lips twisted into a smirk. "Suit yourself, but don't say I didn't warn you." With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Keanu standing alone in the alley. The dog whined softly, its small body trembling against his chest. Keanu looked down at the fragile creature in his arms, his expression softening. "Don't worry, little guy," he murmured. "We'll figure this out, together," as he carried the dog back to his modest home on the edge of the neighborhood. He couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was just the beginning. Clayton's warning hung heavy in the air, but Keanu's resolve was stronger. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of purpose, a reason to fight, and he wasn't about to back down. The small house at the edge of Golden Oaks was modest but welcoming, a sharp contrast to the rigid, cookie-cutter homes that lined the rest of the pristine neighborhood. Keanu pushed the door open with his shoulder, careful not to jostle the scruffy dog cradled in his arms. The little creature had stopped trembling, its head resting weakly against his chest as though surrendering to exhaustion. He set the dog gently on an old plaid blanket he'd laid out on the couch. Kneeling beside it, Keanu's fingers moved deftly, checking for deeper injuries beneath the matted fur. The dog winced but didn't pull away. Its soft eyes fixed on him with a flicker of trust that pierced through his heart. "You're tougher than you look, aren't you?" he murmured. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of a clock and the dog's labored breaths. Keanu stood and rummaged through his fridge, pulling out a small piece of grilled chicken left over from dinner. He shredded it carefully and placed it on a plate, setting it on the floor in front of the dog. "Eat, buddy. You need your strength." The dog sniffed hesitantly, then began to eat, its movements slow but deliberate. Keanu watched in silence, his thoughts drifting. It had been years since he'd felt this kind of connection, the kind that transcended words and demanded action, the kind that reminded him what it meant to care. As he leaned against the counter, the memories crept in, uninvited but familiar, the laughter of his wife, the mischievous grin of his son, and the quiet nights they'd shared in a home filled with warmth, a home he'd lost in the blink of an eye. He shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. Tonight wasn't about the past. It was about this little dog that life had so clearly abandoned, just as life had once abandoned him. A sharp knock at the door shattered his reverie. Keanu's brow furrowed as he moved to answer it, his movements cautious. Standing on the porch was Mrs. Evelyn Harper, the elderly woman who lived 2 doors down. She clutched a plate of cookies in one hand and a flashlight in the other. Her expression was soft but concerned. "I saw you bring him home," she said without preamble, her voice trembling slightly. "That little dog. I wanted to say thank you." Keanu's surprise must have shown on his face, because she smiled faintly and added, "Most folks around here wouldn't bother. They'd just call animal control and wash their hands of it. But you, well, you're different." He opened the door wider, gesturing for her to step inside. "Come in, Mrs. Harper. I could use some advice." They sat in the small living room as Keanu shared what had happened, his voice steady but laced with the quiet intensity that had made him a legend in another life. Mrs. Harper nodded, her weathered hands gripping her teacup tightly. "Clayton's been running this neighborhood like a dictatorship for years," she said finally. "But don't let him scare you. That dog deserves better. And so do you." Her words lingered long after she left, echoing in Keanu's mind as he watched the dog curl up on the blanket, his breathing now soft and even. For the first time in a long time, he felt the faintest flicker of hope. Maybe this dog wasn't the only one who needed saving. Before I continue this incredible story of resilience, redemption, and unexpected friendships, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever fought for something or someone you believe in, hit that like button, because this story is about to remind us all why standing up for what's right can change everything. Morning arrived with golden light spilling through the windows. The dog stirred as Keanu approached, carrying a small bowl of water. He crouched beside it, offering the bowl with a soft smile. "Good morning, Shadow," he said, the name coming to him as naturally as the bond that had formed between them. The dog's tail gave a hesitant wag, and Keanu couldn't help but chuckle. "Yeah, you like that, don't you?" But the calm was short-lived. Keanu glanced out the window and saw Clayton, clipboard in hand, marching up the sidewalk with his signature air of authority. Keanu straightened, his jaw tightening. Shadow whimpered, as if sensing the tension. The knock at the door was sharp and deliberate. Keanu opened it slowly, meeting Clayton's smug expression with a calm resolve. "Mr. Reeves," Clayton began, his voice dripping with condescension. "I see you've decided to ignore the HOA's policies. That's a problem." Keanu leaned casually against the doorframe, arms crossed. "No, Clayton. What's a problem is how you think you can bully people into following your rules without question." Clayton's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "You have 48 hours to remove that dog, or I'll see to it that you're fined and evicted, if necessary. Rules are rules." Keanu stepped closer, his tone measured but firm. "You can keep your rules. I'm keeping Shadow." as Clayton stormed off, muttering threats under his breath. Keanu turned back to Shadow, who wagged his tail with renewed vigor. "Looks like we've got a fight on our hands, buddy," Keanu said softly. "But I promise you this. I'm not backing down." And so began a battle that would test not just Keanu's resolve, but the very fabric of a community divided by fear and control. But as he looked down at Shadow, whose trusting eyes held a glimmer of hope, Keanu knew one thing for certain. They were in this together. The days that followed felt like a brewing storm. Keanu quickly realized that Clayton's threats were more than empty words. Flyers warning about a dangerous stray began appearing in neighbors' mailboxes, complete with exaggerated claims of attacks and property damage. The whispers started soon after sideways glances. The soft hum of voices silenced whenever Keanu passed. The community was turning against him, and Shadow was at the center of it all. But not everyone was swayed by Clayton's propaganda. Mrs. Harper stopped by every afternoon with fresh-baked muffins and quiet encouragement. "People around here are just scared of change," she said one evening, stroking Shadow's head. But fear is no excuse for cruelty. Keanu's resolve hardened. He wasn't just fighting for Shadow. He was fighting against a system designed to silence anyone who didn't fit Clayton's perfect mold. That night, he opened his laptop, searching for anything he could find about HOA policies and community rights. The deeper he dug, the more unsettling the patterns became. Clayton wasn't just enforcing rules. He was profiting from them. Inflated fines, suspicious contracts with landscaping companies owned by his relatives, and opaque financial reports pointed to a web of corruption hidden behind a facade of order. The next morning, Keanu visited Evelyn Brooks, a young mother whose son often played in the park near his house. She was one of the few neighbors who had smiled at him despite the rumors. "Evelyn," he began, his voice low but steady, "I need your help. Clayton's been twisting the truth, and it's time we fight back." Evelyn listened intently as Keanu laid out what he'd uncovered. Her eyes widened as he showed her the discrepancies in the HOA's financial records. "This isn't just about Shadow, is it?" she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "He's been exploiting all of us." Keanu nodded. "The question is, how far are we willing to go to stop him?" By the end of the week, a quiet alliance had formed. Evelyn, Mrs. Harper, and even Samuel Burns, a retired police officer with a no-nonsense demeanor, joined Keanu's cause. Together, they began gathering testimonies from other residents who had been unfairly fined or intimidated by Clayton's heavy-handed tactics. Slowly but surely, the tide was shifting, but Clayton wasn't going down without a fight. One afternoon, as Keanu walked Shadow through the neighborhood, a sleek black car pulled up alongside him. The window rolled down, revealing Clayton's cold smirk. "You really think you can turn people against me?" he sneered. "I've been running this place for 10 years. No one's going to side with a stray-loving outsider." Keanu met his gaze without flinching. "The truth has a way of coming out, Clayton, and when it does, you'll have nowhere to hide." As the car sped off, Shadow let out a low growl. Sensing the tension, Keanu crouched beside him, running a hand over his scruffy fur. "Don't worry, buddy," he whispered. "We're not done yet." That evening, Keanu filed a formal motion to challenge the HOA's policies and demand a public audit of its finances. The announcement sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Residents who had once avoided Keanu now approached him cautiously, some to offer quiet support, others to satisfy their curiosity. Even those who still sided with Clayton couldn't deny the growing undercurrent of rebellion. But with the HOA meeting just days away, tensions were higher than ever. Keanu knew the stakes. If he failed, it wouldn't just mean losing Shadow, it would mean letting Clayton continue to manipulate and exploit the very people he claimed to protect. Would the community rally behind Keanu when it mattered most? Or would Clayton's grip on Golden Oaks remain unbroken? And could one scrappy dog really spark a revolution in a place built on rules and conformity? The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and the air was thick with anticipation. Keanu walked into the community center with Shadow trotting confidently by his side. The once scruffy terrier, now clean and full of energy, had become a quiet symbol of resilience. Neighbors filled the rows of folding chairs, their whispers creating a low hum that bounced off the sterile walls. At the front of the room stood Clayton, flanked by the board members who had long been complicit in his unchecked authority. His smile was tight, his eyes cold as they met Keanu's. Keanu took his seat near the front, his shoulders squared, Shadow sitting obediently at his feet. Evelyn and Mrs. Harper were nearby, nodding their silent support. Samuel Burns stood by the door, his arms crossed, watching the crowd with the quiet vigilance of a man who had spent years reading the tension in a room. Keanu didn't speak, but his presence spoke volumes. Clayton banged the gavel, calling the meeting to order. "We're here to address a critical matter of community policy," he began, his voice ringing with authority. "One of our residents has chosen to challenge the rules that maintain the harmony of Golden Oaks." Keanu rose from his seat, his calm presence commanding the room. "This isn't about harmony," he said, his voice firm but measured. "This is about control, about fear, and about using those things to take advantage of people who trusted you to act in their best interests." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some in agreement, others uncertain. Keanu stepped forward, holding up a thick folder. "I've spent the past few weeks uncovering the truth, and it's a truth that everyone in this room deserves to hear." He handed the folder to Evelyn, who began distributing copies of the documents inside. Financial records, emails, and testimonials from residents who had been unfairly fined or threatened. Each piece of evidence painted a damning picture of Clayton's leadership. The room grew quieter as the weight of the information sank in. "This community was built on trust," Keanu continued, his voice steady. "But that trust has been betrayed. Inflated landscaping contracts, kickbacks, fines that seem to appear out of nowhere, all while claiming it's for the good of the neighborhood." Clayton's face hardened, his confident facade beginning to crack. "These are baseless accusations," he snapped. "You're just a washed-up outsider with no idea how this community works." Keanu didn't flinch. "An outsider who cares more about this community than you ever did," he replied evenly. "This isn't just about me or Shadow. This is about all of us. And it's time for things to change." Mrs. Harper stood then, her frail frame trembling but her voice unwavering. "Keanu's right. I've lived here for 20 years, and I've watched this place become more about fear than community. We deserve better." One by one, other residents began to stand. Evelyn spoke about how her family had been fined for trivial infractions. Samuel recounted his own run-ins with Clayton over unnecessary penalties. Each voice added to the growing momentum, a tidal wave of frustration that had been held back for far too long. Clayton's attempts to regain control grew more frantic. He shouted about rules and order, about preserving the integrity of Golden Oaks. But his words fell on deaf ears. The community had finally seen him for what he was. The board members exchanged glances, their earlier loyalty to Clayton now replaced with visible discomfort. Finally, one of them, a middle-aged woman named Janet, cleared her throat. "I think it's time we vote on new leadership," she said, her voice soft but resolute. The motion passed quickly and decisively. Clayton's face turned pale as the gavel fell for the last time under his hand. He stormed out of the room, his exit marked by the quiet murmurs of neighbors who had once feared him but now saw his power unravel. As the meeting drew to a close, the new board president, Janet, addressed the room. "We have a lot of work to do to rebuild trust and transparency," she said, her voice steady. "But today marks a turning point for Golden Oaks. Let's build the kind of community we can all be proud of." Keanu sat quietly as applause filled the room, his hand resting gently on Shadow's head. For the first time in years, he felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. It wasn't just about winning the fight. It was about proving that standing up for what was right, no matter how small or how difficult, could change everything. Shadow wagged his tail as the applause continued, his small frame standing tall beside the man who had saved him. Together, they had done what no one thought possible. They had brought hope back to Golden Oaks. As the dust settled from the stormy HOA meeting, Golden Oaks felt like a neighborhood reborn. The oppressive grip Clayton once held was gone, replaced by an air of cautious optimism. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now lingered on their porches, waving at one another, rediscovering the sense of community they hadn't realized they'd lost. Keanu leaned against the railing of his porch, watching Shadow chase a butterfly across the freshly trimmed grass. The little dog's tail wagged furiously, his injured leg still causing a slight limp but failing to hinder his spirit. Keanu couldn't help but smile. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was a symbol of everything this neighborhood had forgotten: resilience, loyalty, and the courage to stand against adversity. The faint sound of footsteps drew his attention. Evelyn approached with a folder clutched tightly in her hands, her brow furrowed with both determination and nervous energy. "Keanu," she began, her voice steady but soft. "There's something we need to talk about." He gestured for her to join him on the porch, offering her a seat. She placed the folder on the table between them, flipping it open to reveal a series of detailed financial records. "This is everything we could gather about Clayton's dealings," she said, tapping a page. "It's worse than we thought. The landscaping contracts were just the tip of the iceberg." Keanu scanned the documents, his expression darkening. Payments to phantom companies, unexplained withdrawals from HOA funds, and personal expenses disguised as neighborhood improvements. It was a house of cards waiting to collapse. "If we bring this to the authorities," Keanu said slowly, "he's going to face real consequences." Evelyn nodded. "But it's not just about him anymore. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. The board has asked me to help rewrite the HOA's bylaws to protect residents and ensure transparency. I was hoping you might join me." Keanu looked at her, surprised. "Me? On the board? You've already proven you care about this community," Evelyn replied, her tone earnest. "We need someone who's not afraid to do what's right, someone who listens, who acts." He hesitated, his gaze drifting to Shadow, now dozing contentedly in the sunlight. The idea of stepping into a leadership role was daunting. He had come to Golden Oaks seeking solitude, not responsibility, but he also knew that walking away now would leave unfinished business. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Evelyn smiled, sensing that he already knew the answer. The days turned into weeks, and as the new HOA board took shape, Keanu found himself drawn into the process. He attended meetings, offering insights and ideas that reflected his quiet wisdom. The bylaws were restructured, emphasizing fairness and accountability, and new initiatives were introduced to foster a sense of belonging among residents. Shadow became something of a local mascot, his story inspiring even the most reluctant neighbors to rally behind the new vision for Golden Oaks. Children played with him in the park, and older residents often stopped by Keanu's porch to drop off treats or simply enjoy Shadow's company. The little dog had brought the neighborhood together in ways no one could have predicted. One crisp autumn morning, Keanu stood before the community at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new dog park funded by donations and volunteer efforts. Shadow sat proudly at his side, his tail wagging as if he understood the significance of the moment. "As someone who came here searching for peace," Keanu began, his voice steady, "I never imagined finding a place that felt like home. But home isn't just where you live. It's the people you share it with. And I've learned that even the smallest actions can spark the biggest changes. Shadow taught me that." The crowd erupted in applause, cheers mingling with laughter as Shadow barked enthusiastically. Keanu glanced down at the scrappy little dog that had changed everything. He reached down, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "Good boy," he murmured, his voice filled with gratitude. As the ceremony wrapped up and the park filled with the sounds of laughter and barking, Keanu felt a quiet contentment settle over him. His journey had been unexpected, challenging, and at times overwhelming. But it had also been worth every step. For the first time in years, Keanu Reeves felt like he truly belonged. As the dust settled from the stormy HOA meeting, Golden Oaks felt like a neighborhood reborn. The oppressive grip Clayton once held was gone, replaced by an air of cautious optimism. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now lingered on their porches, waving at one another, rediscovering the sense of community they hadn't realized they'd lost. Keanu leaned against the railing of his porch, watching Shadow chase a butterfly across the freshly trimmed grass. The little dog's tail wagged furiously, his injured leg still causing a slight limp but failing to hinder his spirit. Keanu couldn't help but smile. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was a symbol of everything this neighborhood had forgotten: resilience, loyalty, and the courage to stand against adversity. The faint sound of footsteps drew his attention. Evelyn approached with a folder clutched tightly in her hands, her brow furrowed with both determination and nervous energy. "Keanu," she began, her voice steady but soft. "There's something we need to talk about." He gestured for her to join him on the porch, offering her a seat. She placed the folder on the table between them, flipping it open to reveal a series of detailed financial records. "This is everything we could gather about Clayton's dealings," she said, tapping a page. "It's worse than we thought. The landscaping contracts were just the tip of the iceberg." Keanu scanned the documents, his expression darkening. Payments to phantom companies, unexplained withdrawals from HOA funds, and personal expenses disguised as neighborhood improvements. It was a house of cards waiting to collapse. "If we bring this to the authorities," Keanu said slowly, "he's going to face real consequences." Evelyn nodded. "But it's not just about him anymore. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. The board has asked me to help rewrite the HOA's bylaws to protect residents and ensure transparency. I was hoping you might join me." Keanu looked at her, surprised. "Me? On the board? You've already proven you care about this community," Evelyn replied, her tone earnest. "We need someone who's not afraid to do what's right, someone who listens, who acts." He hesitated, his gaze drifting to Shadow, now dozing contentedly in the sunlight. The idea of stepping into a leadership role was daunting. He had come to Golden Oaks seeking solitude, not responsibility, but he also knew that walking away now would leave unfinished business. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Evelyn smiled, sensing that he already knew the answer. The days turned into weeks, and as the new HOA board took shape, Keanu found himself drawn into the process. He attended meetings, offering insights and ideas that reflected his quiet wisdom. The bylaws were restructured, emphasizing fairness and accountability, and new initiatives were introduced to foster a sense of belonging among residents. Shadow became something of a local mascot, his story inspiring even the most reluctant neighbors to rally behind the new vision for Golden Oaks. Children played with him in the park, and older residents often stopped by Keanu's porch to drop off treats or simply enjoy Shadow's company. The little dog had brought the neighborhood together in ways no one could have predicted. One crisp autumn morning, Keanu stood before the community at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new dog park funded by donations and volunteer efforts. Shadow sat proudly at his side, his tail wagging as if he understood the significance of the moment. "As someone who came here searching for peace," Keanu began, his voice steady, "I never imagined finding a place that felt like home. But home isn't just where you live. It's the people you share it with. And I've learned that even the smallest actions can spark the biggest changes. Shadow taught me that." The crowd erupted in applause, cheers mingling with laughter as Shadow barked enthusiastically. Keanu glanced down at the scrappy little dog that had changed everything. He reached down, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "Good boy," he murmured, his voice filled with gratitude. As the ceremony wrapped up and the park filled with the sounds of laughter and barking, Keanu felt a quiet contentment settle over him. His journey had been unexpected, challenging, and at times overwhelming, But it had also been worth every step. For the first time in years, Keanu Reeves felt like he truly belonged. The quiet peace that had settled over Golden Oaks in the weeks following Clayton's removal was shattered one stormy evening. The clouds hung heavy in the sky, lightning flashing in the distance as the first drops of rain began to fall. Keanu was in his living room, tossing a ball for Shadow to chase when a loud knock echoed through the house. He opened the door to find Samuel Burns, the retired officer, standing there, his face grim. "Keanu," he said without preamble. "We've got a problem. Clayton's not done." Keanu stepped aside to let him in, his mind already racing. "What happened?" Samuel closed his umbrella, his voice low but urgent. "I overheard some of the old HOA members talking at the coffee shop. Clayton's trying to rally support to file a lawsuit against the new board. He's claiming the vote to remove him was unlawful. But that's not all. He's been spreading lies about Shadow, saying the dog attacked someone." Keanu's jaw tightened. "He's desperate. Desperate people can be dangerous," Samuel said, his tone heavy with experience. "And if he manages to get enough signatures to back his lawsuit, it could stall everything we've worked for." The rain began to pick up, tapping insistently against the windows. Shadow, sensing the tension, padded over to sit by Keanu's feet, his tail wagging softly as if to reassure him. Keanu reached down to scratch behind his ears, drawing strength from the dog's quiet loyalty. "What do we do?" Keanu asked, looking at Samuel. "We need to get ahead of this," Samuel replied. "Talk to the neighbors. Remind them what we're building here. If enough people stand with the new board, Clayton's got nothing." Keanu nodded, determination hardening his features. "I'll start tonight." Despite the rain, Keanu and Shadow moved from house to house, speaking with neighbors and sharing the truth about Clayton's latest scheme. Most were supportive, but a few were hesitant, their fear of retaliation still lingering. "He can't hurt you anymore," Keanu told them firmly. "We've already proven we're stronger together." By the time they returned home, Keanu was drenched, but his resolve was unshaken. Shadow trotted beside him, his fur damp but his spirit unbroken. Keanu dried them both off and settled into his chair, his mind spinning with plans to counter Clayton's moves. But the reprieve was short-lived. The next morning, Keanu woke to the sound of Shadow barking furiously. He jumped out of bed and rushed to the window, his stomach sinking at the sight of his front yard. Someone had vandalized his property overnight. The words "Dogs don't belong here" were spray-painted in angry red letters across his fence. And his newly planted flowers had been uprooted, their petals scattered across the lawn. Keanu stepped outside, Shadow close at his heels, growling low in his throat. The sight of the destruction fueled Keanu's anger, but it also solidified his determination. Clayton's fearmongering wasn't just an attack on him. It was an attack on the progress they'd all made as a community. Later that day, as Keanu and Samuel worked to clean up the mess, Evelyn arrived with a group of neighbors carrying tools, paint, and potted flowers. "We're not letting him win," she said simply, handing Keanu a fresh can of paint. One by one, more neighbors joined, their presence a testament to the unity that had begun to take root in Golden Oaks. By evening, the fence was freshly painted, and the garden was even more vibrant than before. Shadow roamed among the workers, wagging his tail and accepting pats from everyone. As the sun set and the last of the neighbors left, Keanu sat on the porch with Shadow at his feet. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and cool. Samuel sat beside him, a cup of coffee in hand. "You think this is over?" Keanu asked. Samuel shook his head. "Not yet, but people are starting to see through Clayton. That's half the battle." Keanu looked out at the yard, at the neighbors who had stood with him, and felt a flicker of hope. They weren't just fighting for Shadow or against Clayton. They were fighting for something bigger, for a community worth believing in. And as he scratched behind Shadow's ears, Keanu knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't stop until they'd won. The final showdown came faster than anyone expected. Clayton, backed into a corner and desperate to regain control, had filed an emergency injunction against the HOA, demanding the reinstatement of his presidency and the immediate removal of Shadow. The hearing was set for a week later, leaving Keanu and the community little time to prepare. But if there was one thing Keanu Reeves had learned in his life, it was that some battles were worth fighting, no matter the odds. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse buzzed with quiet tension. Keanu arrived early, dressed simply in a dark suit, Shadow walking obediently at his side. Despite the stern warnings to leave the dog at home, Keanu had refused. Shadow had been at the heart of this fight from the beginning. He deserved to see it through. The courtroom filled quickly, with neighbors from Golden Oaks taking up nearly every seat. Mrs. Harper sat near the front, her hands clasped tightly, while Evelyn and Samuel nodded encouragingly as Keanu took his place at the defendant's table. Across the room, Clayton sat stiffly with his lawyer, his usual smugness replaced by an air of barely concealed frustration. The judge entered, her sharp gaze sweeping over the room before settling on the parties involved. "We're here today to resolve the matter of Clayton versus the Golden Oaks HOA," she began. "Mr. Clayton, you claim your removal was unlawful and seek reinstatement, as well as the enforcement of HOA bylaws regarding unauthorized animals. Is that correct?" Clayton stood, his voice clipped and rehearsed. "Yes, Your Honor. The bylaws are clear. Pets like that stray dog pose a liability to our community, and the recent leadership changes were handled improperly." The judge turned her attention to Keanu. "Mr. Reeves, you're representing yourself and the HOA today." Keanu rose, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Clayton's rigidity. "Yes, Your Honor, and I'd like to present evidence that not only refutes Mr. Clayton's claims, but also reveals a pattern of corruption and abuse of power during his tenure." With the judge's permission, Keanu began his presentation. Evelyn distributed copies of the documents they'd gathered, and Keanu methodically walked the court through each piece of evidence. He showed the inflated landscaping contracts, the unauthorized withdrawals from HOA funds, and the fabricated violations used to intimidate residents. "These are not the actions of a leader protecting a community," Keanu said, his voice steady. "These are the actions of someone exploiting their position for personal gain." The room was silent, the weight of the evidence impossible to ignore. Even Clayton's lawyer appeared uneasy, flipping through the documents with a furrowed brow. Keanu's next move was unexpected but brilliant. He called Mrs. Harper to the stand, followed by Evelyn and Samuel. Each testified to the fear Clayton had instilled in the community and the hope they now felt under the new board's leadership. When asked about Shadow, Mrs. Harper's voice broke slightly as she spoke. "That little dog brought us together," she said, her gaze fixed on the judge. "He reminded us what it means to care for something beyond ourselves." Finally, Keanu stood again, his closing words echoing through the courtroom. "This case isn't just about bylaws or leadership. It's about what kind of community we want to be. One ruled by fear and control, or one built on trust, compassion, and accountability." The judge leaned back, her expression thoughtful. After what felt like an eternity, she delivered her ruling. The removal of Clayton was deemed lawful, the new leadership upheld, and the motion to remove Shadow was denied. Furthermore, an independent audit of the HOA's finances was ordered, with Clayton facing potential charges for fraud. A wave of relief and quiet celebration rippled through the room. Clayton stormed out, his face red with anger, while Keanu simply leaned down to scratch Shadow behind the ears. "We did it, buddy," he whispered, back at Golden Oaks. The mood was jubilant. Neighbors gathered on Keanu's lawn, bringing food, drinks, and laughter that hadn't been heard in years. Shadow, now a certified hero, trotted proudly among them, soaking up the attention. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Keanu sat on his porch with Shadow curled up at his feet. The stars above were bright, the night peaceful in a way that felt earned. Mrs. Harper joined him, a cup of tea in her hands. "You've done something incredible here," she said softly. "You didn't just save that dog. You saved all of us." Keanu smiled faintly, his gaze on the horizon. "I think we saved each other." Shadow let out a contented sigh, his small body warm against Keanu's legs. The fight had been long, exhausting, and at times overwhelming, but in the end, it had been worth it. Golden Oaks was no longer just a place to live, it was a community. And for the first time in years, Keanu Reeves felt at peace. What a journey, right? From a scrappy little dog to a community that rediscovered its heart. This story truly reminds us that even the smallest lives can inspire the biggest changes. If the story of Keanu and Shadow touched your heart, let us know. Drop a 2 in the comments if you loved it, or a 7 if you think it could be better. Your feedback helps us grow and share even more incredible stories. And hey, if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button to join us here on Tapestry of World. We have so many more stories of resilience, love, and hope waiting just for you. Thank you for being part of our community.